Thanks so much for coming to today's event. I'm Cooper Wetherbee, MBA class of 2023, and a student leader of the Corporations in Society Initiative, or CASI for short. CASI is a faculty initiative here at the Graduate School of Business that engages with students and visiting experts on issues at the intersection of markets, business, government, and society to promote more accountable capitalism and governance. Oftentimes, business schools promote a sort of self-serving mythology that everything can be a win-win, that what is profitable is also by definition good for society. One of the reasons CASI exists is to challenge that notion, to start conversations on campus about the very real and consequential trade-offs that exist both in business and in government between doing what is profitable, what is easy, what is popular, and what is right. I expect that today's event will address those themes directly, and I'm looking forward to the conversation between Bethany McLean, Tariq Fancy, and of course all of you during our open Q&A session later on. With that, I'll hand things over to CASI founder and faculty director Anat Admati to introduce today's guests. Anat is the George G.C. Parker Professor of Finance and Economics at the GSB and has researched and written extensively on the topics of financial markets, banking regulation, and corporate governance. She's responsible for arranging much of the great programming here that falls under the CASI umbrella, including today's wonderful event. So Anat, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Cooper. CASI lives by our awesome student leaders and energized by it. That keeps me going. So welcome, everybody. I am really happy to see those of you here and many of you on Zoom. The title of this event has like a little equation with a question mark, and it says CSR plus ESG equals BS, question mark. I assume you know the BS part, what that means. What CSR and ESG is, you know, especially CSR, you may not know, because CSR goes back to the 60s and 70s, where the debate was about corporate social responsibility. And this is what Milton Friedman, in a very famous essay in 1970, where he argued that, you know, the social responsibility of corporations to make as much money as possible, really ridiculed these pontificating CEOs that speak of CSR, corporate social responsibility, who he said will bring back the government, the iron fist of government bureaucrats who are going to destroy our free markets. That's the way he reacted to these people who speak about corporate social responsibility. So that article had a big impact since 1970. Especially people took away from it, corporations should just make money and leave alone anything else, which we may even agree with under some conditions. The debate intensified, and these days people worry about all kinds of things: climate change, inequality, diversity, you know, attitudes to gender, attitudes to race, and political polarization. So people worry about these things, and the latest sort of buzzwords are stakeholder capitalism and ESG. And ESG stands for environmental, social governance. That's what it stands for. Now, what it means, we'll talk about it. You may have heard that 181 CEOs of top US companies made a statement in 2019 saying that no, they don't no longer just care about shareholders, which is what they said in the 70s. They now care about the customers and the employees and the suppliers and the community. So they're good. They made that statement. And then you may have heard also that we have a lot of ESG investment and ESG ratings and ESG actions by corporations and disclosures and all kinds of debates about that. But then, as the debate intensified, it became very political. So then what happened was, you know, BlackRock CEO, the company that our guest worked at, Larry Fink, said corporations should do good, should take care of society, et cetera, et cetera. And now there's a backlash. Now some state governors and treasurers are taking money out of BlackRock. Now they're saying that, you know, banks discriminate against fossil fuel and they're going to not do business with them. All this backlash against woke capitalism, another word in the jargon of this debate, woke capitalism. So you got these forces. So this is all super confusing. And so the questions are, what should be the roles of corporations in society? what should be the balance of power between corporations and governments? Who in the world should take care of us, and how do they do this given what they can do, their powers, and their incentives, whether they are politicians or executives? So whether you're new to this debate or you have some position on it already, what we have today is a conversation that will help us move this discussion forward, which is what we at CASI want to do. So I'm discussing this, by the way, I'll plug my own courses in all my classes to MBA audiences and others. I'm not teaching the undergrad audience this year, but I will in the future if you're undergrads. And both of these speakers visited my classes. Now, Bethany actually comes to all the accounting classes, so anybody here in the MBA program already knows who Bethany McLean is. But for the others, I'll introduce. Bethany McLean is an award-winning investigative journalist and author. She started her career as an investment banking analyst at Goldman Sachs before joining Fortune, later Vanity Fair as a contributor. She's known for writing, became famous over her coverage of Enron, starting with the understatement, is Enron overpriced, and then to a book called The Smartest Guys in the Room, which was also made into a movie, and later a book about the financial crisis, and she has a book forthcoming that I'm sure we'll hear about the handling of the pandemic. And she's been here already and visited CASI events. She's a great friend of CASI. She just moderated one with Judge Rakoff about corporate fraud just a year ago. And so she'll introduce our main guest today, Tariq Fancy. She also has, by the way, is associated with a sister organization in Booth called the Stigler Center, where she has a podcast called Capitalism. So I'll do a little push of that. I'm thanking Tariq Fancy, who braved the travel woes of today to make it here after a long day yesterday, and to Bethany, who dared to leave Chicago in the winter again and come to California in the winter. She seems to somehow agree to that easily. Anyway, I'm going to let Bethany take it from here, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for being here. So I first want to introduce our guest, Tariq. You were the Chief Officer for Sustainable Investing at BlackRock. And we're going to come back to this later, the founder of an educational company called the Rumi Initiative. And you've emerged as a really prominent critic, not of ESG per se, but rather of the very trendy notion of ESG investing as a mechanism for change. And so I think our goal in this conversation is for you to help us figure out the nuances of a topic that seems really simple on the surface. Isn't it the right thing for all of us to put our money into things that advance the social and environmental goals that we want to see? But it's actually anything but. So going to Anat's comments, I wanted to start at the very beginning. ESG, sustainable investing, impact investing, responsible investing, ethical investing. What do these terms mean, and do any of them actually mean anything at all?
So first of all, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here to speak. ESG, I mean, the best way to think about it is sort of to start with what the financial services industry says it is, right? So generally speaking, it means taking the art of investing in finance and overlaying a set of additional considerations, environmental, social, and governance, by which they mean corporate governance, considerations over that investing style, and it allows an asset manager to do two things primarily. So number one, you have a bunch of existing investment activities. If you're BlackRock, it's 10 trillion or whatever it is, and now you can create a new category of vehicles, green products, that purport to do something in addition to gaining a market return, right? To create some special green benefit or whatever. So in a sense, from a financial perspective, they're kind of like if you go to Walmart and you have the green detergent next to the regular detergent, or some green premium price sustainability. I think it's kind of like that for the financial service industry. So that's number one. And that new category is very popular for the industry because it means new assets and growth. And they usually almost always have premium prices attached, right? So the average ESG fund is 41% higher fees than non-ESG fund. So that's there. The second thing ESG means is not a product, a new product, as much as a process enhancement. So what they say is, okay, well, here's the existing stuff we were doing from before that's not new, that whatever trillion or whatever it is, and we're going to overlay ESG considerations onto that. And that means looking at another data set to help you invest. And the premise is always held by the industry that ESG data is really, really useful for us to invest with, because better ESG performance means better returns, which is financial jargon for saying responsible companies or good companies, right, which is a higher ESG score in theory is what's been implied, they're also more profitable. And so to translate what that means, I would think about capitalism as a sport, right? It's a competition. So I personally am a big soccer fan, but I use basketball because I think North Americans need to hear this more than Europeans, a little by a notch. So let's imagine we're comparing it to basketball. On the court, you're a player, and you have to focus on scoring against one scoreboard, right? Points. And you only win points. The game is won or lost on points. There's no good sportsmanship category that, it can play into the game, but the final determinant is the points. Capitalism is similar. It's a competition, but the bottom line is profits. And what's important is that the players are locked into going for profit, so I can get into that in a minute. Yep. But anyways, ESG, the idea is that good sportsmanship leads to scoring more points, right? That we live in a world that rewards that, and it's a win-win.
So there's a lot in there to discuss. I had another question for you, and I think you've provided part of the answer for it with your observation that ESG products carry far heavier fees. But there's this number predicted by Bloomberg Intelligence that more than 1/3 of all globally managed assets could carry explicitly ESG labels by 2025, amounting to more than 50 trillion. Why has ESG investing become such a hot fad on Wall Street? Or have we already covered that?
Yeah, so first of all, we have to start with those numbers. They're just completely ludicrous. And they're ludicrous for a few reasons. First of all, having seen on the inside, it's kind of generally known that there's no concrete definition on what that is, because it's hard to define these things, right? ESG in general, and the E things are fairly quantifiable, but the S get very difficult and are hard to measure, and it's very, very subjective. And so when they usually put these labels on funds, there's really no rigor around it or no clear body that's been in charge, and so a lot of it's just box ticking. And there's an important reason why it's box ticking. It's because they legally can't say that we're going to look at ESG always and do the better thing, because it would be a violation of fiduciary duty. So fiduciary duty is this law that basically says if you're managing someone else's assets, you have to focus on maximizing the value of those. And I'm simplifying, and the idea is that that's measured in value, not values, right? Because everybody has different values. Right, I always joke, if you're in Europe and you go to France, nuclear is great, and then you go to Germany, nuclear is the worst. But value is objective, right? And so they have to think about value in terms in dollars. So they really can't do these things, and there's just different variations of like these sort of sustainable labels. And obviously, the worst of these massive numbers that effectively mean nothing, like one way of looking is if you graph the growth in ESG and green assets, they go up alongside carbon emissions and inequality over the last 10 years, like exactly the things they're meant to do something about. And the problem is multifold. Number one, there's no definition, any of that. So it's just non-binding marketing pledges that we will consider ESG while we invest. But you can't say you're definitely going to do it because you'd be violating fiduciary duty. And not to mention their incentives of the people making decisions are also aligned, in terms of higher return. So in general, the problem with those sorts of statistics, they don't really mean anything. Right, and so at some point, if all you're doing is putting green paint on an existing system, the argument starts to turn from, isn't this harmless, right? Because, hey, how can green investing be worse than like what we were already doing, to, is this becoming a dangerous placebo, or what I call a convenient fantasy to address an inconvenient truth that allows us to believe that we can keep everything the same and not incur any sacrifice, or from an economics perspective, taxes and regulation, right, which are the actual expert and Nobel Prize winning sort of ideas on how to address this, and just have more ESG stuff, lots of ESG firms, and they're rating them, and then better performers do better and make more money, and then the system corrects itself without us needing to change the rules in any way.
Before we come back to that idea that it is a convenient fiction, a dangerous placebo, let's go back to you a little bit. How did you first get involved with questions of sustainability? And how did you see these ideas start to impact the mainstream investing world? And what was the beginning of your skepticism? We're going to call it skepticism, not cynicism.
Okay, good. So the skepticism comes from a real place, which is that my background was that I I wanted to do something in academia. I missed out on a scholarship in the final round of undergrad. I grew up in Toronto, went to school in the States, and then ended up doing banking, and actually ended up down the street. I was here in Palo Alto doing tech banking for a guy called Frank Quattrone at the tail end of the dot-com bubble. That led to me eventually going back to New York and being hired by a client who was a distressed or a vulture investment firm. And so my old boss had been the chief investment officer for a guy called Carl Icahn. And, you know, it's very aggressive, sharp-elbowed side of finance, very, very skeptical, borderline cynical. But it's because you go into situations where management teams are likely to lie to you because it's a distressed situation, right? So no matter how bad the company's going, it's like you're always at the bottom of a hockey stick when you meet them, right? Because they're not going to show you continuing decline. So a bit skeptical. Left sometime after, did grad school, and then ended up doing Rumi, which is a nonprofit. And it brought me back here, actually, because it was a nonprofit. We went through Y Combinator. And, you know, the whole thing is really using a smartphone as a learning tool. And having left the industry and having kind of been on the extremes of purpose and profit, that's kind of how the role found me, that BlackRock was kind of leaning into, and a lot of financial firms were leaning into this area because they saw growth potential. And so anyway, they created a new role as chief investment officer for sustainable investing.
And were they leaning into it, do you think, because they saw growth potential and the potential to make more money? Because they saw that, because they really believed that it could change the world? Or because they saw it as a way to keep the status quo while enabling us all to believe that we were doing our part to change things?
So you ask a really interesting question, because as an ex-insider, it wouldn't be fair for me to say that I think people know that they're doing that, because I don't. I actually think that if I could drink the Kool-Aid, it would be ludicrous of me to then throw it on other people and say, well, other people drank the Kool-Aid. So, you know, I don't cast aspersions on anyone inside the system. I think a lot of people are sort of siloed, and or they don't have necessarily the requisite skill set, because being a distressed person, you are good at one thing above all else that pretty much drives how the financial industry actually works, is that you can read incentives. And if you don't change incentives, then you're not going to change the behavior of the system, right? And if incentives are misaligned, and one of the problems about ESG is for all of its bluster, it doesn't actually do the one thing that changes the industry, which changes incentives. In fact, it distracts us from the fact that we're not. Yeah, sorry, did that answer?
It did. So let's go back to something you touched on earlier, which is this idea of profit and purpose. Can there be an overlap? Is there a Venn diagram in which there is an overlapping area? Or do you think the two always have to be separate? And how do you think about all the competing numbers out there about ESG? I mean, the claims from the industry that it does lead to better returns. Paul Tudor Jones famously launched his firm 5 years ago saying ESG does lead to better returns, but then there are other pieces, including a recent study saying, no, it doesn't. And so do you think there's an overlap, or do you think believing that there is an overlap is inherently dangerous? And how do you sort through all the conflicting numbers?
So first of all, a lot of these studies are really dubious. They're done by people who are self-interested to believe that. That's one of the things I wrote about in this one paper I wrote that went viral called The Secret Diary of a Sustainable Investor. It was 4-part or 3 parts, and I added an epilogue. But you know, the idea was that a lot of people want to believe this. And so on some level, I think in academia, there is a very innocent desire to be seen to be providing encouraging signals to business that if you do this little ESG thing, you'll do better and the world's a better place. And it comes from a good place of wanting to encourage them to do that. Having been inside the system, again, when I look at how the money moves, I think ultimately the only question we have around, especially the environmental issues, is one of, are we going to rely on voluntary compliance or mandatory compliance? And I actually look at a massive value transfer going across different groups in society around that. And I look at some of these ESG studies that are based on bankrupt data. And, you know, first of all, it's so hard to measure ESG that you can make the data say whatever you want, because you can regress returns or whatever you want against a moving target.
Right.
And having published academic research myself, and I'm not an economist, it was cited in the Canadian federal budget, I can honestly tell you that you can kind of torture the numbers to make it say things that you want, and you know, so the conclusion has to have common sense. And so the problem with a lot of these studies is they seem to be intended to serve that goal. I don't know if people are intentionally necessarily doing that, but through the system of incentives and power, it kind of comes out that people say it as not a countervailing voice in the system, because Like if you say ESG is good for returns and purpose and profit overlap, like you get a lot of consulting work with companies. If you go and say you need regulation, like who's paying you to say that? You know what I mean? Like the government's not hiring you on a contract. So the incentives are move in one direction. And so it is difficult to make sense of any of that stuff. And my concern has been that if you look at it, some of what business seems to be doing looks like the tobacco industry in the 50s, right? So I'm a capitalist, but I think it's important to distinguish between two types of capitalism: Tesla capitalism and tobacco capitalism. Tesla capitalism is we need more EVs and we need them fast so you can shake up the industry and create stuff people need and move in that direction. That's great. By the way, government has a role to play there, right? Government can actually go in and push more of that. And the best example of that is think of how we produce a vaccine in record time. It wasn't like they just sat around, right? Operation Warp Speed had billions of dollars in direct funding and R&D to companies, a billion vaccine pre-orders, expedited approval processes. So government can push Tesla capitalism more. And then there's tobacco capitalism. Tobacco capitalism is, I have a profit stream of $100 that is at risk of regulation, right? Regulating the sale of minors, all kinds of things that happened in the 50s when we realized that smoking causes cancer, or started to realize. And so if you have $100 of a profit stream and you realize that you could protect it with $20 of marketing and $15 of lobbying, technically that's what you should do. And no one wants to go out and say that in business, even though that's what fiduciary duty generally means, is that, unless you can create an argument that, that'll come back and haunt you, or, some PR risk, or this, that, and the other, but it has to be internalized by society, right, that externality, unless, if the government isn't doing it. And so what you see is tobacco companies, they put out something in 1956 called a Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers. And it said, of paramount importance to us is the health of our customers. And oh, by the way, here's some, maybe smoking doesn't cause cancer. Like here's some other evidence, right? And all we know what that was about. That was basically about them protecting their profit stream as long as they could. A study at Yale showed that 8 million American lives were saved because of the regulation of tobacco. Right? It's 8 times the COVID pandemic. Now it's 2019, right? Let's go back to a few years ago. And coming out of the financial crisis seems to be an inadequate amount of the one thing that we probably all wanted, which was some level of regulation to fix the system. It doesn't believe all that seems to have gone out of the system is trust, which has unfortunately found its way into the weird cryptocurrencies and other things, right? They're justifying them. But there doesn't seem to be as much of regulation. And let's be honest, obviously that's in part because after 2010 and the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, the players on the court have an unlimited ability to recycle their potentially ill-gotten gains into protecting those loopholes. So of course they do that, right, through a system of lobbying and payments and other things. And so 2019, the Business Roundtable then comes out with something called, was a stakeholder capitalism statement. And it basically is it's the equivalent of like the good sportsmanship pledge, right? And they're like, we're going to do a lot of good stuff for people, and it's in our interest, and it's a new way of doing business. And they pretend to depart from the Milton Friedman view of the world, which is this economist who said that like just focus on profits. And in the end, 2 law professors at Harvard Law School did a study, and they found that 98% of the boards that signed that thing had not ratified it with their own board of directors, which means it has no legal meaning because you're registered in Delaware, and there's a very clear set of laws that you have to focus on shareholders at the end. I mean, it was a PR statement. And like at some point you look at that and you think, is that being responsible, right? One more stat, sorry I keep blathering on, but this is an amazing one from last summer. They surveyed and found that 58% of the C-suite believe that their own companies are guilty of greenwashing.
Wow.
0% of the PR teams are saying that. By the way, in the US, I
take it that was an anonymous survey.
I don't know, it was definitely an anonymous survey. It was Google Harris Cloud. If you Google it, it's amazing. The best part is Americans, it was 68%. It's like 2/3. See, so it's like at some point they kind of know that their incentives are misaligned with the public interest. Like the greatest example of that, by the way, is Larry Fink, my old boss, CEO of BlackRock, is a founding member of something called Focusing on Capital for the Long Term. And it's an initiative that comes out of the fact that all this research shows that capitalism becomes too short-term oriented, right?
Yes.
CEO pays the highest it's been in decades, 320 times the average industry worker. The 10 years, shortest being decades, 5 years. And so they don't really care about the long term. It's not in their incentive line. That's why they see a slow-moving systemic curve. We need to flatten greenhouse gas emissions. They're like, maybe the free market will solve that, even though it's obviously a market failure. And then along comes a fast-moving systemic curve that we need to flatten. It's COVID. And the incubation period is not a few decades, it's a few weeks. And they're all suddenly like, call the government. And they all support, the Business Roundtable actually looked, it supported not just we should wear masks, but there should be mandatory mask mandates, right? There's like, I mean, we should restrict travel. All the things that the government did, right? Which number one, it's flatten the curve in one hand, using, this is not neoliberalism. This is like the hand of government comes in, right? And then on the other hand, you galvanize the private sector to find solutions. That was Operation Warp Speed. Yeah. We've sort of done the second one, but it's with a lot of carrots and not a lot of sticks. And it's like, because it's impossible, it seems, to raise taxes. And so the Inflation Reduction Act seems to be setting off an arms race with Europe in terms of subsidies. But generally, it helps. But we haven't done that. We haven't done really nearly as much on curbing business, especially around the E issues.
So I loved your comment about torturing the numbers. As a former math major, I'm really good at torturing the numbers, and learning how much they could be tortured has been part of my education in the business world. But is what you're saying essentially that capitalism can be either about changing the status quo or it can be about protecting the status quo, and that some of the incentives, even the legal requirements for corporations to maximize profits, are essentially protecting the status quo?
That's pretty much it. I think that, it can be used to galvanize a better status quo in terms of, like, there's no question in my mind that capitalism is the best system to, if used correctly, to pull out the innovations we need. And they're so much harder than what people make them out to be for net zero, right? In terms of, like, actually, if you look at food production, all these other things of how fossil fuels play in, it's extremely difficult. So I think we can get solutions if we direct capitalism effectively. But we also need to be honest about the ones that are not in our interests, where it's the tobacco capitalism. And my biggest concern is that the leaders of the system today don't seem to actually understand the difference, or feel that there's some obligation to show real leadership in the 2020s and say that there's a difference, right? And it's not unimportant. So one of the things I found really interesting was that, because of the other thing I do, roomies, really Gen Z users, a lot of young people, hits underserved communities. And I did a session with them once, because I'm still a board chair there, to talk to them about sort of the stuff we're doing. And they basically, you could sort of see amongst young people in the data, they don't believe in capitalism anymore. And it's one of the things I worry about a little bit, is that, if that continues too long, it creates political instability.
Yep. There's an interesting intellectual commonality between you and Anat Giridharadas, who wrote a book essentially arguing that a lot of what our leaders do as charity is actually a way of keeping the status quo as it is and preventing change rather than encouraging change. And it seems to me that your argument about ESG investing is of a piece with that intellectually, that a lot of it is about keeping the status quo rather than actually changing the status quo. Does that sound fair?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think the one difference between myself and him is probably that he's a journalist and I'm an ex-insider. And I tend to be pretty skeptical and cynical. I would say, if I honestly thought people were in the middle of the system, like trying to screw us, smoking cigars in a room, that's not what it is. At the end of the day, the system, power will have a greater voice in conversation, whether it's Davos or here or there. It'll bend towards where people have interest, right? The public policy team will try to slow tax rises and regulation. The ESG team will paint whatever they're doing green, right? Which is like, it's like a fruits in the grocery store 30 years ago. If no one polices what it is to be organic, you'll all put the sticker on, right? So everyone's saying they're doing it, and yet nothing actually is. And I think, in that context, I think, you almost need to sort of figure out a way to get money out of politics and sort of unlock the different mechanisms of changing it.
Before we come back to government action, I wanted to pause on another potential solution and have you tell me why it's not a solution. Okay. So part of the problem is that corporate law requires companies to put shareholders' interests first, and investors are required to put fiduciary duty first. Why can't we just change those laws? And why can't your investment products and companies carry an explicit disclaimer? We're not putting these things first. We're putting other things first. Why wouldn't that be a way to solve these issues?
So it sounds like an alluring idea in practice. It means like changing fiduciary duty to sort of be like, okay, now you can consider other stuff. There's one reason it won't work. Okay. It's that everybody has different values, and I don't really want my banker redesigning society. You know what I mean? It's like, Oh, like that would basically be saying that like the Larry Finks of the world, hey, we're going to give you the tools to decide like what society, how we should make society better. And there is one point where the Republican pushback against ESG is right, is that they're saying, look, you don't have a democratic right to make that argument, right? Like no one elected Larry Fink.
Yep.
Where they don't continue to argue far enough is that to really hand the keys back to people who respond to the public, you'd also need to get money out of politics, I would say.
Yeah, so let's dig into that a bit more explicitly before we come back to this idea of mandatory government action. There is some commonality, as you just mentioned, between you and one of the most prominent critics of ESG from the other end of the spectrum, Vivek Ramaswamy, who wrote a book called Woke Inc., arguing basically that corporations have no place in advancing any kind of environmental, social, or governance goal. Where do you two meet, and where do you think you again, have intellectual commonality, and where do you think you differ?
So where we differ is where I just mentioned probably most of all. He makes
money.
the argument that that the government has a democratic right because you're being elected, and so don't loosen fiduciary duty. Keep it tight, and the government should use regulations to change behavior. For example, mandatory restrictions or taxes on carbon, whatever it is. And so I think unless you get money out of politics, he's got half the argument right, but then the other half doesn't make any sense, which, given that he's backed by Peter Thiel and a bunch of like libertarian types who don't seem to want regulation, it doesn't surprise me all that much. Like for the same reason that when I went out there and wrote The Secret Diary of a Sustainable Investor, I never used the word Democrat or Republican because I don't think it's my role to really go in and I just want to make arguments without landmines that people will fall into. And the Wall Street Journal loved half my argument. I said, ESG doesn't work, we need regulation. They loved the first. The second, they forgot about, seems. And so on that point, I think Vivek and I are different, but I do think he makes a lot of interesting and very good points around the fact that business leaders are pretending to show leadership and actually almost cowardly at times. And the point he talks about how business leaders will say here will be ready to throw themselves behind the latest fashionable cause. And it doesn't seem to be really based on conviction more than it is sort of a convenient PR strategy. And yet in China, they won't say a thing. And he's absolutely right. It's weakened American leadership, and it's an example for me of where American capitalism is getting in the way of American democracy at exactly the worst time in history for that to happen.
Why do you say that? Why do you say the worst time in history for that to happen?
I think for a whole bunch of reasons that we probably won't be able to get into today, whether it's trends of reversing globalization, of rising inequality, the backlash against globalization, because we only did half the deal, right? Because globalization expands the pie, but it's going to rapidly redistribute the pieces, and so you need worker retraining and all kinds of other things. The first part happened, the second didn't, in part because it didn't seem like you could even raise taxes or really, so it just massively increased inequality. You look at all those things at a time of extreme political polarization, right, of which, of course, started with cable media and then it's been supercharged by algorithms. I think democracy is under threat like never before. Everyone kind of knows that. And there's a strong authoritarian model. I think it's easy for us to take for granted in the West that a lot of the world doesn't agree with the NATO position on Ukraine and Russia and other things. And this seems to me like the worst time for business leaders to be recorded in history. Like these are all digital traces, right? I mean, I look at it and I'm like, why are you putting your name on a building? Like at this point, like you're just renting that space for 10 or 15 years because we all know the science is real and there's digital traces of everything right now. So at some point we have to almost pull the moral cloak of responsibility away. And I think one thing where Vivek is right probably is that, and where we share it, is that you don't get the moral cloak of respectability if all you're doing is running a cheap PR strategy that's going to switch whenever it's convenient, and we've seen that happen a bunch of times.
And maybe there's another point here there's another point here about the undermining of trust, that everyone is smart enough to be able to see, wait, Disney, you're doing this in order to defend rights in Florida, but yet you're also doing this in China that is an undermining of human rights, and that all of that undermines faith in democracy, trust in democracy, and that's a huge problem at this point in time.
I'd say so. I mean, I think the best example I can tell you of the position of business leaders is to use the Draymond Green theory, which I came up with earlier today. So I'm going to start with the basketball analogy. So imagine basketball's gotten really dirty, and everyone decides we've got to clean up the game.
Right.
And then there's a press conference afterwards, and Draymond Green comes out, And he starts listing all the stuff that like people are doing for, they're doing to play clean and whatever. And, like we have this new coach who teaches us to play clean, blah, blah. One of the random stuff, we went to this hospital on Sunday, all this stuff. And then suddenly one of the journalists says, hey, by the way, Draymond, we heard a rumor that you may be making secret payments to the refs behind the scenes. Do you mind talking about that? And then Draymond just said, nah, and he left. Like, how many people how many people here think that we should believe Draymond and he actually wants to clean up the game? I suspect it to be zero. Okay, so right now, 4 American companies, Boeing, Netflix, Disney, and BlackRock, all 4 of them eagerly put out CSR things, ESG things, whatever, non-standardized for the most part, takes the kind of stuff they're doing, paints it a bit more green, put it out there. I'm sure some of it's real, but it's like mostly just marketing and PR. All 4 of those companies in recent years faced shareholder resolutions from their own shareholders asking them to disclose their political spending, which, as we know in the post-Citizens United era, is otherwise we wouldn't know what it is. It's traceless and limitless. All 4 of those companies fought off those shareholder resolutions. I mean, how can that be the position of business? Our experts in society, we listened to them on the epidemiologists on how to flatten the curve, right?
Yep.
Infectious disease people said, here's how it spreads. Then the epidemiologist said, well, this is a human behavior question, so you got to close the schools. Like, you can't leave the sports bar open the night of the big game and expect, when there's no vaccine, that you're going to like stop the spread, right? We had to be honest about it. And now business leaders are in a position where climate scientists have told us that, and we're all around this biodiversity and sustainability, that we're going to need regulations, we're going to need to start making changes. And their corollary is going to be economists. And the economists are saying it was a human behavior question. Like Bill Nordhaus, the guy who talks about carbon tax, actually has a line where he says, look, there's trillions of transactions, billions of people and firms, millions of different players in the system. There's no way you can do that without a systemic solution. And business leaders are in a position of basically preventing a lot of those behind the scenes through lobbying and spending. It destroys the actual soul of capitalism, and it destroys the foundation of the system.
So it seems to me that the conundrum inherent in what you're saying is that we have these decades of history that have undermined trust in government, and trust in business is now higher than it's ever been, at least according to this recent study, perhaps self-interested by Edelman. But in order to advance the solution that you think is important, which is government action, that requires the very trust in government that's lacking. So how do we resolve that conundrum?
I think the biggest question we should ask is to business leaders, how are you going to help? How are you going to fix the government? Because the week I started, is this week or the second week I started, beginning of 2018, Larry Fink writes this letter where it makes this big splash all over the world and in the corners of Davos and whatever. And in it he says the company should have a social purpose, right? And it got all this attention. But it's the way he said it. He said specifically the government is failing on a set of issues that are clearly of importance to the public interest, whether it's building infrastructure or retirement savings or sustainability or whatever else. And he said, therefore, business leaders should step in with social purpose. Clearly, they don't have the incentives to do that, right? And it's very clear they have no answer to anything that people like myself and others have pushed back on. They just ran off the PR stage. And, and I say, like, it's impossible to show the world the emperor has no clothes if he locks himself in the bathroom and doesn't come out. And I think the real question we should ask them is that, listen, like, this is democracy 101. Like, you can't replace the role of elected politicians. Even Milton Friedman said that. He said it would be intolerable on political principle of them to do that. So I think the question for business leaders is, how are you going to fix the government? How are you going to fix democracy at a time? And that has to start for me with looking at political spending. Like, I don't care. Like, how can a company hide their political spending and not get an automatic 0 ESG score? Yep. Like, that's an instant red card for me, right? And I think it's just dishonest of them, and at this point almost constitutes a value transfer from the junior employees, junior, more diverse employees, to the richest people at the top, because the system is so short-term oriented. We're squeezing out value at the public interest. Someone's going to pay for that.
I was thinking when you were talking, there's a great quote from Camus that fiction is the lie that tells the truth, and I'm not sure if anybody in the room has read the book Cloud Atlas, but it's essentially a dystopian world in which corporations have become government no longer exists. It's all corporations, and sometimes I wonder if corporations actually want that world and if they want to fix government. I'm going to ask one more question, and while we do that answer, if you all want to start lining up to ask whatever questions you might have, that would be great. But I wanted to get at one fundamental objection to what you're saying might be, but rules. We don't want rules for our free market. The great glory of the free market. Why should we be restrained by any rules? And won't that inhibit the functioning of the free market? What would you say in response to that?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, the greatest hoax is the free market hoax, right? Like, ask any lawyer. A market is just a collection of rules. You can change those rules and you'll get different outcomes, all of which can be considered market outcomes. And I think those rules are deliberate, right? So it doesn't make any sense to say that the government's intervening in the free market any more than it would say that, like, the NBA is intervening in the game of basketball by drawing a line behind which you get 3 points for a shot. They can move that line back if they want less three-pointers. Like, those are all deliberate rules that create outcomes of the system. And I think, this reflexive anti-regulation push has to be replaced by a more intelligent understanding of the fact that systemic solutions are going to require the power of government because it has powers to make things mandatory rather than voluntary and to make them systemic across all quarters, which we don't see. Even the financial market stuff moves from public to private hands and just bounces around because people are getting paper profits on reducing emissions. And so I think, it's a combination of things, probably.
So while we wait to see if there are any questions from the audience, Cooper, are there any from Zoom? And why don't we go to the Zoom channel first, and I'm going to have Cooper step up and read those.
Yeah, thanks, Bethany. A couple questions from our virtual attendees here. First question here. If the work of ESG analysts and teams has little impact on the investment decisions in the asset management companies, could it be assumed that most ESG rhetoric is greenwashing, whether intentional or unintentional?
That's a good question. I think it really depends on what you say the goal is of ESG. One of the biggest challenges for the industry is it never actually clarified whether this is good for investors or good for the planet, right? And those are completely different things. But because of the nature of fiduciary duty, as I discussed earlier, they kind of had to say it was good for returns, otherwise you couldn't be doing it. So they said, it's great for returns, and then it was kind of left like unclear, is it good for the planet or not? And in the end, doesn't really do that much for return. It does in a few places, but really only long-term strategies that are private and illiquid. Most strategies, it doesn't really unlock any value. It doesn't create any value for the world, for sure, in terms of allocating capital correctly. But it's definitely a big win for asset managers. So.
That reminds me actually of this survey that you had pointed to in some of your writings that I guess was done in the summer of 2020, in which most of the public mistakenly believes that managing climate-related financial risks somehow fights climate change itself.
Yeah. So what we found in this study was, number one, no one knows what helps and doesn't help. So when bankers and central bankers and finance people go up and say we're protecting against climate risks, they mean climate risks in their portfolios, not stopping climate change from happening. So the way I explained it is, a friend of mine in Miami this actually happened. He was looking to buy a house, and it was when I was at BlackRock, and he said, I'm worried about the long term, but he said, you guys are so giant, you're focused on climate risks. And he didn't get it until I finally said, listen, we're not trying to stop Miami from getting wrecked by climate change. We're trying to get our money out before it hits. Right? That's pretty much what it means. And so from a moral perspective, it's like the answer to the girl in a village in Bangladesh is like, don't worry, our rich clients are not going to lose any money when your home gets destroyed. But people don't know the difference. 80% of people thought protecting against climate risks in portfolios meant protecting against climate change. The big challenge is that the average person doesn't know that. Like, a lot of what's been pitched in sustainable investing is leverages a lot of ignorance around how the system works, just because the average person doesn't tend to know these things and be super financially literate. And the biggest problem with it is it always concludes that if I do the right thing and I stop doing the wrong thing, then the wrong thing will stop happening, right? So if I divest of oil players, then they're going to be deprived of capital, which does not happen. All that happens is you sell a share to someone else, and because I was a former vulture investor, I know, because we would wait for stuff like this, where people would say, oh, we're going to sell this thing for completely non-economic reasons because it's ethically wrong. And all that happens is, is that it changes hands.
So let's go to a question. Oh, wait, go ahead. Apologies.
Hello. My name is Britta Bomhard. I'm a DCI fellow here at Stanford. I agree with what you lay out, that we probably need fundamental change. But given that we have such a short timeline to act upon climate change, don't you see a role in between, like instead of black and white, a gray zone, to actually get more of what you call the Tesla kind of capitalism going, and what could be the positive forces in that scenario?
Do you mean of the free market self-starting to do that? Or?
Yeah, in the end, we have very little time to act and bring positive action, right? Mm-hmm. You're saying the role is government and regulation, which, yes, in an ideal world would be, but the change is so slow to get the government into that role. So is there intermediate steps we should take right now?
It's a good question. I think, I guess one thing I'd say to start with, when I say government, I would distinguish between government as provider and government as regulator. Where a government as provider is actually building electric vehicles and whatever. That I don't mean. That's would be like refs taking three-pointers. We don't want that. But someone's got to call the fouls, right? And so government as regulator is actually saying, you can, if you pollute, we're going to now fine you for that. We're going to subsidize things. I think there's a cultural change that can get more going with green stuff, but I don't think it's us talking about it more, because I'm actually concerned that it's been talked about so much without really mandatory regulations to back the actual push, that it's creating a massive divergence between expectations and reality. And as I said, I think we ignore that at our peril, right? I mean, people also, young people don't know what capitalism, like I'm 44, the majority of people younger than me don't believe in capitalism. And they say, oh, they don't know what capitalism is. And I'll be like, yeah, but they didn't know what Trump's policies were when they voted for him, or what Brexit meant when they pressed the reset button, right? So all of which is to say, I do think there are things that can be done, but I think that the free market's going to do whatever it's going to, or the market system as currently structured is going to do whatever it's going to do, and it's going to move in the direction and speed it's been moving in. And we could remove the greenwashing and the stopping regulation, because that's just dangerous. And I think take some of the tools that have been built, the ingredients around ESG, around measurement, disclosures, and use them in ways that actually force mandatory compliance. There's a hybrid of solutions that I think can be done, but my concern would be lionizing the few winners and the individual success stories, because that tends to be, in my experience, used to further the idea that we don't need to do anything. So it's like Steph Curry, he's so great, he scores all these points, and he's sportsmanlike, visits the hospitals. Everyone's going to be like Steph Curry. But I'm like, this is a systemic problem. We need masks, but we also need a mask mandate, which means there's a Latrell Sprewell and a bunch of players will punch you in the face over there. So all of which is to say, my concern about a lot of the green marketing is that it might have just made us complacent.
It's really interesting. I think a lot about this idea of storytelling and how important it is, because it's obviously what I do. But there's this notion, I think, behind what you're getting at, that storytelling, when they're stories that are really convenient for us to believe, can be really, really dangerous. Anyway, to you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nick Hill. I'm an MBA 1. You ended with the notion in your remarks about how businesses need to put effort into fixing government to change the regulatory framework. I think you'd have probably a lot of allies with the sentiment in the room. Can I push you on solve? So you were in BlackRock, what would it take to turn a company like that towards making those kinds of efforts on the ground?
So I think you're part of the solution. That's the good news to start with. I'll always tell you, if you told me, okay, we need to fix government. So people will traditionally think, okay, we should go rally the politicians to do stuff. I actually would tell you that I wouldn't waste time doing that, because I think they're not going to move until the Overton window has shifted first from a place where we have this convenient win-win crap to this is going to take sacrifice and cost money, and I think then there's room to do it. And I'd start with the business community, and that's why I've tried to start a debate in the business community. And to answer your question, I think to push them to do the right thing, I don't think they're worried about Elizabeth Warren's office calling them. They have a public policy team. They've been dealing with that for decades. They're going to keep dealing with that. You know what they'll never have a plan for? Is if they suddenly get caught on their flank because all of their younger employees say, wait a second, The question of whether like we love stakeholder capitalism, we all agree, but the real question is, should it be subject to mandatory compliance or voluntary compliance? And they realize that a system that's far too short-term oriented just constitutes a value transfer because, Larry Fink's 70 years old, he gains the most from the system, least at the risk of the consequences of inaction. His 22-year-old entry-level employee, she's in the exact opposite situation. If employees, the younger employees, actually said, wait a second, forget the ESG team, why is our public policy team fighting against binding regulations that would protect the environment? Because we're going to end up eating the cost of that shit. Like, we're going to be around in 2050, like having our first kid or whatever. I actually think businesses wouldn't have any answer to that question. Because as soon as the employees start moving and rallying, the board won't know what to do. Because if you lose the troops, the board's saying like, shit, they know how to deal with the, Sheldon Whitehouse's, office, right? They've been doing that for years and they keep doing that. But I do honestly think that younger employees, this is where I come back to, this is where it all begins, I do think have an outsized voice because they won't have an answer to that. The ESG stuff is being fed to young people, generally speaking, both inside and outside the system. You can sell more to millennials if you have the green detergent, you sell a premium price, no one even checks if it's green, it's a pretty good deal. But if those people turn around and say, wait a second, we followed the experts on, like the epidemiologist said, to usually government things, it clearly hit the economy, right? Notwithstanding the fact that the Federal Reserve dislocated the financial markets, separate question. But generally speaking, it hurt the economy. It's the same players, the Business Roundtable, who are behind the scenes lobbying against flattening the greenhouse gas curve. They don't have an answer to that question, right? I mean, that's why you can't get a debate out of them. Right, it's impossible there's no accountability, right? I mean, imagine if I left and I worked for a minister in the government and I said, this is all crap, this is stupid, it doesn't even work. And I wrote this long paper saying that their argument is totally incoherent. Like, they would have to answer the next day, but they don't have to answer now, right? It's not part of their PR strategy, right? So someone's got to force them to respond, and I don't think it's going to be Elizabeth Warren's office, would be my guess.
Cooper, do we have another question from the Zoom audience?
Yeah, we've actually got quite a few, so I'm going to just do kind of a quick speed round here for you, Tariq. Mm-hmm. So first one, the ESG Convergence Initiative, we were talking about lack of standardized ESG metrics. CalPERS, Carlyle, and others have led 260 private equity general partners for a unified 6-part ESG standard and reporting framework. Just your thoughts on the effectiveness of that type of approach.
Well, so obviously having multiple standards is a disaster. The more that they converge around certain things, and there's questions around materiality, double materiality, generally the more they're standardized, the better, because they can be useful for something. I would stress, this is very important, just to finish that answer, that there's a big difference between measuring something and managing it, right? So if you just have disclosure, that's like VAR without a referee to give out a red card. Like, you see the tackle in slow motion, but like you still need a penalty. So they have to be done in concert.
Awesome. Next one, you use the term responsibility as the key. What would be key elements of a corporate political responsibility movement beyond disclosure of spending?
I think to defend democracy by doing everything in your power to make it succeed, not supporting the polarization of the population, not supporting the regulatory capture by special interests, not avoiding accountability about these issues by going to Davos, which curiously has not many panels on tax increases and stuff like that. Like, I get that these are not convenient for them, but to pretend that these debates don't need to happen is a heist that's being committed against younger, poorer, darker-skinned people. Like, it's not missed on me that Larry Fink is older, richer, and whiter than I am, and it's the groups I represent that are losing out from this stalling, right? So anyway, hopefully that answers.
Yeah, that's great. The last one here. Just a question about the recent movement toward B Corps and other firms with social impact embedded in their core businesses and often in their governance documents, and whether you think that's an effective approach to address some of these social ills and needs.
It's not harmful, but the idea that that is the solution is. In and of itself, they're helpful. But the idea that that's the solution is extremely dangerous, right? Because remember, in the post-World War II period, there were better outcomes in terms of economic inequality in this country and better outcomes in terms of the environmental protection. By the way, Richard Nixon founded the EPA in 1970, and there was no parallel system of like nice stuff and badges for good people, because you need a systemic solution. And so my biggest concern is that when they put green labels or B Corps or on the side thing, there's nothing harmful in and of itself, and you can create businesses that move in that direction. But never for a second can we be fooled into believing that that's the solution, even if they want to market themselves as being that. Because from a size perspective, look at the biggest B Corps and compare them to the Fortune 500, and then wonder how much time we have left. Like that's not the answer.
So one more over here, and then I have one last question for you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Henry. I'm an undergrad. Just to draw, I guess, attention to the Convergence Initiative, it was created by a Stanford alumni and represents the largest in total assets under management at over 10 trillion, additionally with 260 general unlimited partners. I guess my questions are, the 6 metrics they use are GHG emissions, renewable energy, diversity, work-related accidents, net new hires, and employee engagement. What are your thoughts on those metrics?
Well, first of all, I'm really impressed that this initiative has such strong PR behind it. Was this Stanford linked? I know a little bit about it, but it's private equity specific, right?
Yeah, so she leads the ESG. She's the leader of ESG at CalPERS and worked with Carlyle and BCG to publish this.
So I would say the same I'd said of other things. In general, standardization and better reporting is good, but not if we think that that's sufficient. That may be necessary as a step, but it's not sufficient. And I would love, here's a real question for private equity industry. I would love for them to commit to both this initiative for better reporting for companies, and then also in the guise of responsible and fair capitalism, including, for their younger and more diverse employees, also disclose how they've used any kind of political spending to influence debate on the carried interest tax loophole. Wouldn't that seem a fair thing? Listen, I'm an ex-insider, so I'm not a socialist, but I represent a different group in this. So these are shared economic problems, and there needs to be negotiation about them. And I think initiatives like this are good. There's smart people behind it, and they know very well that this should be part of a broader conversation in a democracy.
So the last question, one that plays on something Anat and I were talking about earlier. You mentioned earlier we all agree with stakeholder capitalism. Do we? Should we be aiming for a world in which Milton Friedman is actually right and corporations can just focus on making money because government can focus on setting the rules under which corporations should make money? And if that's right, what would it take to get to a world in which Milton Friedman can be right?
Can be right in terms, so I guess it's almost 2 directions. It sounds odd, but one direction, you'd need to have enough regulations that the government could actually control the private pursuit of profit in a way that generally helps the public interest and is more controlled. Obviously, if you have a slow-moving system responding to regulatory tax needs, as the U.S. does today, you're not going to get that movement. But in theory, you could go in that direction. But that doesn't change the need for a wholesale change in culture. The one thing I think that is challenging of the Milton Friedman model is the idea that, you should only try to squeeze money out, because if you combine that with short-termism and capitalism and a set of other things, you end up in a situation that's really damaging. My concern, though, is that when people say we should depart the Milton Friedman model, they're right. But, if you mean from a cultural perspective, like it took us 50 plus years to get here, right? And we've built complex bureaucracies that are squeezing profits out of every last step. I don't think you can undo that with changing the culture of business. You're going to need to do both the regulatory push, which moves kind of towards Milton Friedman saying you can just focus on profits and let the referees marshal things. But you also do need to change the culture of the game. They both need to happen. But mandatory compliance is the key, because you'll never get there as fast as we need without that.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for these really insightful remarks. I think we have a long way to go from where we are, but I'm grateful to you for starting to raise some of these really important questions.
Thank you.